The portal tore open at 0314 hours local time, and no one on Earth had ever seen anything like it. Sergeant First Class Webb was pulling the last of his overnight watch when the sky above Firebase Raven split along a seam that had no business being there. A vertical gash maybe 2 kilometers wide, burning at the edges like a wound being cauterized from the inside out. The light that poured through was the wrong color. Not wrong the way a sunset is wrong, or a chemical flare is wrong. Wrong the way a thing is wrong when it should not exist. Wrong in a frequency the human eye wasn't designed to process and processed anyway, hitting some deep stem part of the brain that said, something old is here. Something that has done this before. Webb dropped his coffee. The mug hit the gravel, and he didn't even look at it. Within 48 hours, they had a name for the invaders. The name came from the scouts who made it back. Not all of them did, and it wasn't a human word. It was the closest approximation their translation software could render of what the creatures called themselves. The software kept cycling, kept rejecting its own outputs, kept offering alternatives that didn't stick. What the creatures called themselves, translated, roughly, as something between inheritors and those who have always been coming. The linguists shortened it to the Dominion. The soldiers in the field called them something shorter and less printable. And that word spread across every firebase, every command tent, every satellite uplink on the planet within 72 hours, the way fear words always do. They came in numbers that didn't make military sense. That was the first thing the Joint Chiefs established in the emergency sessions that followed. The invasion didn't follow any doctrine recognizable to human warfare. There was no beachhead. There was no attempt to secure logistics chains or establish supply corridors. The Dominion didn't need supply corridors. They seemed to draw power directly from the portal itself, from the slow, grinding merger of whatever was on the other side with the planet they were standing on. The portal was the strategy. While it remained open, they didn't need to win battles. They just needed to buy time, and time was measured in days. 6 of them, maybe 7, before something irreversible happened to the atmosphere, to the geology, to the fundamental character of the world as it had always been. Commander Alara Voss learned this in the ruins of what had been the forward command post in Subsector 12. She was sitting against a collapsed support beam, pressing a torn sleeve against the gash in her forearm, watching smoke rise from 4 different directions, when the man named Raj Chen found her. He moved like he'd been moving through rubble his whole life. Low, deliberate, reading every surface before he trusted his weight to it. He was 34 years old. He had the kind of face that looked like it had heard bad news before, and expected to hear more. He was carrying his helmet in one hand and pressing it against his chest like it was something he'd borrowed and meant to return. He looked at her arm. He looked at the smoke. He crouched down next to her. "How many made it out of the post?" he said. "You're looking at it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 14 people staffed that post. I know how many people staffed that post. He sat down beside her, not next to her, beside her. There was a difference, and he understood it. He didn't say anything for a while, just looked at the sky where the portal hung, rotating with a slow, terrible patience. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flask, drank from it, and held it out to her without looking. She took it. The whiskey tasted like someone's kitchen, like ordinary life, like a thing that happened in the world before this one. "What do you know about it?" she said. "The portal." "I know we've got about 5 days left before it becomes permanent," he said. "I know the Dominion's generals are already down here. I know the one they call the Sovereign is somewhere in theater and's been broadcasting challenges we haven't been answering. And I think we have to start answering them." She looked at him. His face was the same, expecting bad news, accepting it, moving through it. "One of their generals killed Captain Doyle this morning," she said. "Doyle had 2 inches of height on you, 40 pounds of muscle, and 11 years of special operations work behind him. The general broke his neck in about 4 seconds. I know. So what makes you think you're the answer?" He took the flask back and looked at it. "I don't," he said. "I think we're the answer. All of us still standing, but somebody has to keep standing long enough to find out what that means." His name was Raj Chen, and he had grown up in a small apartment above a garage in Kolkata, the son of a woman who had worked double shifts at a textile plant and sung songs under her breath while she cooked. Songs she said her mother had taught her. Songs whose words he had never fully learned, but whose melodies he could reproduce without thinking about it, humming them the way you breathe, without choosing to. He had come to the military late, at 23, after 2 years of university that ended when the money ran out, and he had discovered that he was good at the work in a way that surprised everyone except himself. Not because he was the strongest or the fastest or the most technically proficient, because he was relentlessly, almost pathologically hard to break. Every instructor he had ever had eventually ran into the same wall with him. The thing they expected to stop him simply didn't. He absorbed it and kept moving. His file, if you pulled it, was a record of that quality expressed in operational terms. 3 tours before this one. 2 injuries that should have ended careers and didn't. Not because the injuries weren't serious, but because he had spent both recoveries doing the work of getting back, with the same focused patience he brought to everything, as if returning to operational status were a technical problem with a known solution, and the only variable was how much effort you were willing to put in. His commanding officers described him in evaluation reports with the same cluster of words: steady, persistent, hard to rattle, and then usually added something in the comments section that was harder to quantify. One officer had written, "What makes him effective is not something that appears on any assessment rubric I've been given. He simply doesn't accept that things can't be done. Not in a reckless way. In a considered, stubborn, patient way that makes the things that can't be done end up getting done anyway." He had never fully known what to do with praise like that. It didn't feel like a description of anything special. It felt like a description of what anyone would do if they kept paying attention. He hummed his mother's song, now, under his breath, while he stripped and cleaned his sidearm in the ruins of Subsector 12. And Alara Voss watched him do it and decided she was going to trust him. They found the others in the hours that followed. Staff Sergeant Dana Osi was running a field dressing station in the basement of a collapsed transit hub, working with 2 medics and no real supplies. Doing the thing medics do, which is hold the line between alive and not alive through sheer force of refusal. She was short and precise, and had a laugh that sounded incongruous in crisis and surfaced anyway. She had been trying to reach the command net for 6 hours, and the command net was gone. They found Lieutenant Yusuf Amara at the edge of a vehicle graveyard, the only survivor of his unit, sitting on the hood of a burned-out personnel carrier, eating a ration bar with the focused attention of a man eating his last meal and choosing to enjoy it anyway. He was a large man, the kind of large that comes from a lifetime of physical work rather than training, and his mechanical prosthetic arm, fitted after a roadside incident 3 years prior, was slick with a fluid that was not oil and not blood but something in between. He'd been in a fight with something that had hydraulics. He'd won. The evidence was 40 meters away and upside down. He looked at the prosthetic. He looked at them, he said, "It still works, in case you were wondering." And then he finished the ration bar. He did not explain what had happened to his unit. They didn't ask. There was a grammar to these moments, an unspoken agreement that accounting came later. That later was only possible if you kept moving now. That the names you carried were yours to carry on your own terms. Yusuf folded the ration wrapper with a tidiness that was almost absurd in context, tucked it in his jacket pocket, and stood up. He was the kind of man who cleaned up after himself even in the ruins of a war. Especially in the ruins of a war, maybe. Some kind of signal to himself about what kind of world he expected to be living in when this was finished. He picked up his kit without being asked. He followed them without being asked. When Raj laid out what they knew about the anchor, Yusuf listened with the quality of attention that engineers give to problems. Total, structural, looking for the load-bearing elements. And then started asking questions that went precisely to the 3 things none of them had thought to wonder about yet. He was annoying about it, in the way that only genuinely useful people are annoying, because the questions were right. The 4 of them sat in the vehicle graveyard and took stock. "The portal's not a weapon," Alara said. "It's a clock. As long as it's open, they don't need to beat us. They just need to outlast us. 6 days, maybe 5 now, before the merger becomes irreversible. So we don't fight their war," Raj said. "We fight ours, which is, we find what closes the portal. And we close it." "That's not a plan," Dana said. "No," he agreed, "it's a direction. Plans we build on the way." What they had learned. From the fragmentary intelligence that was still trickling through degraded channels, from the captured Dominion communication devices, that a signals team had partially cracked before being overrun, from the things the returning scouts said before they couldn't say anything anymore, was that the portal's stability depended on something the Dominion called a convergence anchor, a physical component, not supernatural, not unknowable, a device with mass and dimensions, that had been placed somewheres in the city during the first hours of the invasion, before any human response had been organized. The anchor was what kept the seam open. Destroy it, and the portal destabilized. The merger failed. The Dominion lost their power source. The Dominion knew this too, obviously. The anchor was guarded. The anchor was at the center of what had become, within days, a controlled zone the size of a Zid-sized city, patrolled by things that made the forward command post seem like a reasonable engagement. They had 5 days. They moved at night, using the rubble the way Raj moved through rubble, reading every surface, trusting nothing, keeping low. The city that had existed a week ago was barely recognizable. The Dominion didn't terraform in the way science fiction had always imagined terraforming. They didn't change the planet, they overlaid it, the way you'd overlay a transparency on a document. The streets were still there. But something else was there too, growing up through the cracks, crystalline and dark, pulsing with a light that moved like a slow heartbeat. The buildings still stood, but they were occupied in ways that changed their character entirely, changed the feel of them. The way a room changes when the person in it is the wrong person. On the second night, Raj was watching a patrol when he realized the city still smelled like itself. Under the burning, under the ozone charge of the crystalline overlay, under the wrong frequency light, the city still smelled like rain on old concrete, like cooking oil from somewhere above, like the river 3 kilometers east that had never been beautiful, but was undeniably there. He filed that away. He didn't know what to do with it yet. He filed it the way you file things that feel important before you understand why. They don't think we can adapt, Dana said, on that same second night, watching a Dominion patrol from the second story of a gutted office building. They've never fought anything that adapted. How do you figure, Yusuf said. Look at them. She nodded at the patrol. 4 figures moving in a pattern. They haven't changed the patrol route in 2 days. Same interval, same timing, same formation. They think we're done. They think what's left of us is running, not planning. She paused. They don't understand what we do when we're scared. What do we do when we're scared? Raj asked. We get mean, she said simply, without relish. A statement of fact. On the 3rd day they found the man named Callum Ash. He had been a structural engineer before the invasion, and he moved through the overlay city the way a person moves through their own house in the dark. By memory, by feel, by a knowledge that was in the body rather than the mind. He knew where load-bearing walls had been, where drainage channels ran, where the power grid had followed old property lines in ways that made no logical sense to anyone who hadn't grown up with it. He had been mapping the Dominion anchor's position by triangulating the pulse patterns in the crystalline growth. The growth was denser near the anchor, the pulse rate higher, the light a marginally different frequency, and he had narrowed it down to a 6-block radius. He was the most frightened of all of them. He didn't hide it, and he didn't apologize for it. He moved through the occupied city terrified and meticulous. And the meticulousness was not in spite of the fear but because of it. He was careful precisely because he understood the cost of not being careful. And he understood it viscerally, in the palms of his hands every time he turned a corner. Before the invasion he had been the kind of person who calculated load tolerances before trusting a staircase. He brought the same rigor to route selection through a city occupied by extra-dimensional invaders, and found, to his own strange relief, that the skill transferred. He had also, in the 3 days since the invasion, accumulated a mental catalog of everything he had observed about the Dominion forces. Their movement patterns, their communication behaviors, the way they interacted with the crystalline overlay, which structures they avoided and which they were drawn to. He had written none of this down because writing things down left traces, and traces were dangerous, so it lived in his head, organized with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years making sure things didn't fall down. He also had coffee. Real coffee, from a hand crank grinder and a camp filter, the smell of it hitting them in the stairwell before they saw him, and producing in each of them, independently, an emotion that was difficult to name, and had something to do with the specific persistence of ordinary life in the presence of its own extinction. He handed them cups without asking. He watched them drink. Then he spread his maps on the floor and showed them what he knew. Here, he said, the pulse density peaks here. Some kind of underground space. Old metro maintenance tunnels, pre-grid, the anchors down there. He looked at Raj. The approach corridors are the problem. Walk me through them. 3 entry points. All 3 are currently occupied by what I'd describe as sentinels, not patrols, stationary, big. I watched one of them not move for 11 hours. I watched a rat cross directly in front of it and nothing. They're not watching for small things. They're watching for soldiers, Alara said. They're watching for a threat they understand, Ash said, which is not necessarily the same as what's coming. Raj looked at the map for a long time. He was humming again. Barely audible, the melody his mother had given him. And the others had learned by now that this was when he was thinking hardest, when the problem was getting turned in his hands like an object whose weight was being assessed. They broke the rules, he said finally. What? The Dominion. The invasion. There was supposed to be a tournament, some kind of formal challenge, some protocol. They broke it. Came through anyway. He looked up. They think we don't have rules either now. They think because they broke theirs, we don't have any. They've been fighting like that. Like there are no limits, no constraints. He paused. That's their mistake. How is that a mistake, Dana said. Because we have limits. We've always had limits. We fight inside them. That's why we're good at it. He tapped the map. They're watching for something that fights like they fight. Big, direct, overwhelming force. They don't know how to watch for someone who comes at a problem sideways. What they did in stages, and none of it looked like what it was. Yusuf spent the better part of 12 hours in a maintenance crawl space above the easternmost approach corridor, moving with a patience that was almost supernatural, using tools he'd fashioned from the wreckage around him to introduce a very specific and very localized interference pattern into the crystalline network. He knew the network's frequency from Ash's maps. He knew that the Sentinels drew power from it. He didn't know if what he was building would work. He built it anyway, working in the dark, working by touch, his prosthetic arm navigating apertures the original limb couldn't have managed. At one point the interference spiked, and the crystal around him flared, and the sound it made in the enclosed space was physical. A wall of pressure that hit him in the chest, and he went still and waited, and the flare subsided, and he kept building. He told them afterward that he had been scared the whole time. He said this without embarrassment, without the performance of toughness, just the fact of it. Scared the whole 12 hours, he said. Didn't stop me, just kept me honest. Dana was in a different crawl space, running comms through a patched-together relay that gave them something resembling a common channel, monitoring the Dominion patrol frequencies on the cracked devices, feeding timing information to the others in short-coded bursts. She had been awake for 31 hours. She drank Ash's coffee. She cracked a joke at hour 28 that no one fully heard but that everyone laughed at anyway. The laughter of people who are running on empty and find the reserve that exists below empty. Callum Ash was their map. He moved ahead of them, read the city, told them what it said. And Alara Voss and Raj Chen moved toward the anchor. They moved through the approach that Yusuf had compromised. The Sentinels in it were sluggish now, their response time degraded by the interference, their attention wandering in ways that Sentinels' attention shouldn't wander. The crystalline walls pulsed with that slow heartbeat, and walking through it felt like walking through something alive. Something that was aware of them, and had not yet decided what to do about them. I want to tell you something, Alara said, moving along a wall, not looking at him. Now seems like the time. Okay. When Doyle died, she said, my first thought wasn't the mission. It wasn't the tactical situation. It was, I thought about his hands. He had this habit of flexing his fingers when he was concentrating, just this small thing. And that's what I thought about. Not the mission, not the 14 people, just his hands. She paused. I think that's a problem. I think that's called being a person, Raj said. We can't afford to be people right now. We can't afford to stop, he said. That's different. You can carry Doyle and keep moving. You can carry all of them. That's what people do. You don't have to put them down to get through the door. She looked at him. He was looking forward, checking a junction, moving through it. She followed. The maintenance tunnels beneath the anchor site were a different world from the overlay above. Down here, the crystalline growth was overwhelming. Floor, ceiling, walls, every surface fused and rebuilt in that dark, pulsing material, so that walking through it felt like being inside something's body, inside its chest cavity, moving through the spaces between its organs. The anchor itself was in a chamber that had once been a maintenance hub, the old municipal equipment still half visible beneath the growth, a rusted ladder on one wall, a sign in a language that now felt like an artifact from an impossible previous era. The anchor was the size of a large filing cabinet, roughly rectangular, made of something that was not metal but behaved like it. Inlaid with channels of the same crystalline material in patterns that might have been language, or might have been circuitry, or might have been both. It hummed. Not audibly, below audible. At a frequency you felt in your molars and behind your eyes. Looking directly at it was difficult, in the way looking at the portal had been difficult. The brain registering something it wasn't engineered to process. Some signal from the deep stem that said, "Wrong place. Leave." Neither of them left. The Guardian was there. They'd known there would be one. What they hadn't known was its scale. It stood in the center of the chamber, between them and the anchor, and it was the largest thing Raj Chen had ever seen standing upright. Close to 3 meters. Armored in something that was grown rather than manufactured. The same crystalline over-organic structure as the walls, giving it the look of something that had been built by the planet rather than brought from outside it. Its face, if face was the right word, was expressionless in the way. Faces are expressionless when they have no evolutionary history of needing to convey emotion, when there has never been a reason to show fear or pain or hesitation to anything that might be watching. It looked at them and it said something in the Dominion tongue that the translation device on Alara's belt rendered after a moment as, "You have come further than expected." "We hear that a lot," she said. It moved. It moved with the speed of something that had never needed to be afraid of being slow, that had always been the fastest thing in any space it occupied. And the first pass drove both of them apart, not by impact but by displacement, the shockwave of something that large moving, that fast, pushing in the air ahead of it with physical force. Raj hit a wall, and Alara rolled clear, and the Guardian was already orienting again, processing their positions, recalculating, the way it did everything, like a system, like pure function, like something that had long ago solved the problem of fear by eliminating the need for it. He'd been in bad fights before. He'd been in fights where the outcome was genuinely unclear and the clarity only came later. In retrospect, once he knew he'd survived. This felt different. This felt like a fight that had a predetermined outcome. Like a problem with a solution, already determined, and the variable was simply which one it landed on. He reached for the EMP device. The pack shifted. The Guardian hit him. What followed in the next 8 minutes would be, in the official after-action report, described in the neutral language of tactical engagement. The report would note the use of improvised electromagnetic pulse devices, Yusuf's work, delivered via the pack Alara carried, and their partial effectiveness against the Guardian's power systems. The report would note coordinated flanking movements and the exploitation of the chamber's structural irregularities. The report would note that the engagement was characterized by high adaptability under pressure and resulted in mission-critical objective being achieved. The report would not note that Raj Chen took a blow to the left side of his body that cracked 3 ribs and sent him into a wall hard enough to embed crystal fragments in his jacket, and that he lay there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, assessing the damage, methodically. The way he did everything, no wasted panic, and determined that he could still move, that nothing vital was compromised, and pushed himself off the wall and back into the fight. The report would not note that Alara Voss spent 4 of those 8 minutes drawing the Guardian's attention away from Raj, through a series of movements that she had no reasonable expectation of surviving, using the chamber's geometry and the Guardian's own forward momentum against it, making herself the more visible threat because she was the more expendable combatant in that moment, and she knew it and accepted it, and did not pause over the accepting. The report would not note that while Alara drew the Guardian's attention from the right, Raj circled left and started to hum, without deciding to, "The Way You Breathe." The melody his mother had given him, low and rhythmic, as he moved toward the anchor's base, because that was what happened, and it seemed wrong to leave it out. He reached the anchor. The EMP device Yusuf had designed was simple in principle and required only correct placement and the right sequence of triggers. Raj knew the sequence. He'd practiced it in the ruins 2 nights ago, until he could do it without looking. And this was why you practice things until they were in the hands instead of the head. Because when the head was occupied with a 3-meter armored thing currently trying to get past Alara and reach him, the hands could still work. He placed the device. His fingers found the sequence by feel, by the memory in the skin of them, the same way they found the melody, not a thought but a fact, the body knowing something it had been given and kept. He triggered the sequence. The anchor's hum changed, pitched upward, wrong note, the molars and behind, the eyes feeling spiking suddenly and then dropping, like a power grid failing, and the crystalline channels in its surface flashed once, very bright, and went dark. Above them, 7 stories up and across the city and in the sky above the city, the portal shuddered. It did not close. Not instantly. Nothing catastrophic happens instantly when it's real. The seam began to contract. Slowly at first, then faster, the burning edges drawing toward each other. The alien light diminishing by degrees. The Dominion forces felt it. You could tell, because the city changed, because the patrol stopped patrolling in and started moving toward the anchor site in the way a body moves. When something important has been compromised. The movement carrying that quality of desperation that the Dominion had never needed to show before, because they had never needed to be desperate. They were desperate now. The anchor chamber's guardian stopped. It turned toward the anchor. It processed what had happened. And then it turned back toward Raj Chen with the anchor device in his hands. And its expressionless face registered something. Not quite emotion, but the functional analog of it. Something in the way it held itself. Something in the shift of its weight that Raj would describe afterward as recognition. Recognition of a kind he hadn't expected from something that had seemed so entirely other. Like it was seeing him for the first time. Like it had been looking for the threat and found something that didn't fit the category. "Get down," Alara said. He got down. The EMP burst was the secondary device, the one Yusuf had called the convincer, and it hit the Guardian in a wave that disrupted its power systems completely, dropping it to one knee. One knee for the first time. The first time it had not stood fully upright, and, in the moment it was down, Raj was back on his feet and moving. And Alara was ahead of him, and they were through the chamber entrance and into the tunnel and running. Above them the portal was closing. They made the surface through an access hatch. Ash had marked on the map, emerging into an alley that smelled like rain and burning, and something underneath both of those. Something that was the city asserting itself. Its old smell coming back as the overlay destabilized. The crystalline growth on the walls was flaking, losing coherence, the dark pulse in it irregular now, stuttering. You could watch it happen in real time. The overlay failing in patches, the thing that had been there before the Dominion arriving reasserting itself through the gaps, the way memory reasserts itself through grief. Not erasing the damage but existing alongside it, proving it hasn't been replaced. Yusuf was there, Dana was there, Ash was there. They had tracked the anchor's failure on Yusuf's monitoring device and moved to the extraction point, and they were all there. Which was not something Raj had allowed himself to count on, which is to say he'd counted on it completely. In the way you count on things that you have no basis to count on. That you count on because the alternative is a weight you can't carry and move at the same time. He looked at them. They looked at him. 3 cracked ribs and crystal fragments in his jacket, and a gash along his jaw from a piece of wall that had moved faster than the map suggested walls could move. Alara was bleeding from her scalp, head wounds unreliable in their drama. Dana was already opening the field kit. "The portal?" Raj said. "Contracting," Yusuf said slowly. "But contracting.
Time to full close?
Unknown. Hours. Maybe more. But it won't reverse." Yusuf considered the question the way he considered all engineering questions, with the full weight of what he actually knew versus what he was being asked to project beyond what he knew. "Without the anchor stabilizing it," he said, "the merger can't complete, the physics don't allow it, it'll contract and close." He paused. "That's my read." "Good enough," Raj said. Dana put 3 butterfly closures on the jaw wound without asking permission, and he let her, watching the sky. She was humming under her breath. Something she had apparently picked up from him over the past 3 days, something she would deny doing if anyone mentioned it. He didn't mention it. He let her hum. He watched the seam in the sky, the portal already visibly smaller than it had been 6 hours ago. The burning edges moving toward each other with a slowness that looked like patience, but was actually physics, cause and effect playing out on a timeline that was no longer the Dominion's to control. The Dominion forces that had been moving toward the anchor site were not giving up. That was clear from the sounds of the city, movement, structured and purposeful, the sound of something that had been disrupted and was reorganizing. They had hours, maybe less, and the Dominion still had generals in the city, still had forces that dwarfed what 5 people could handle in direct engagement. "They'll come for the anchor," Alara said. She was holding a cloth against her scalp. "When they find it's gone, they'll come for us." "They won't find it gone," Ash said. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had worked very carefully toward this moment and was choosing to enjoy arriving at it. "I moved it." Everyone looked at him. "While you were in the tunnel, I went back in through the secondary access and moved it." He reached into his pack and produced a component, a module, crystalline and about the size of a small book, clearly separated from the larger device. This is the power interface. Without it, the anchor's a paperweight, and it's currently in a drain tunnel about 400 meters that way, he pointed. If they find the anchor, they find a dead anchor, Dana said. You went back into a Dominion-controlled structure alone. I did, with their forces converging on that location. Also yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, that was incredibly stupid. Yes, he agreed. Did it work though? The question was not rhetorical, and it was not really about the mission. It was a thing humans said, some like this. In the space between surviving and understanding that they'd survived, and everyone there knew what it meant. And the knowing of it moved through the five of them in a way that was not strategy, and was not doctrine, and was not anything the Dominion had ever had a category for. They moved. The hours that followed were not clean, and were not simple, and were not, despite everything, safe. The Dominion responded to the anchor's failure in ways that were simultaneously more chaotic and more dangerous than a coordinated response would have been. Desperation produces a particular kind of force, diffuse and furious, and moving through a city full of it required everything each of them had. Yusuf fought with his prosthetic arm free of its housing, using the armature directly, and it turned out that the question of whether human arms were stronger than cybernetic ones was more nuanced than it seemed, because the answer depended entirely on what you were doing and how angry you were. Dana's laugh surfaced twice more, improbably, in moments that weren't funny, and both times it pulled the others through something they might not have gotten through otherwise. Ash read the city like a text, found paths through it that weren't supposed to be paths, opened spaces in it that weren't supposed to be open. Elara Voss commanded. Not by rank. Rank had stopped meaning what it meant before the portal opened. She commanded by the quality of her attention, by the way she could hold the whole picture and individual people inside it simultaneously, by the way she understood that the picture was made of people, and not the other way around. Raj Chen moved through it all and hummed and kept moving. They reached the defensive perimeter the surviving military forces had established at the city's edge at 019 hours on the 5th day, which was slightly ahead of schedule, and entirely due to Ash's navigation, and slightly due to the fact that the Dominion forces pursuing them had slowed. The portal's contraction affecting their power levels, their coordination, the crystalline growth in the city flickering and failing in patches that spread as the seam continued to close. The portal closed fully at 0344, not with the sound you would expect, not with a shockwave or a detonation. The seam drew to a point, the burning edges met, and then the sky was just the sky. The ordinary pre-dawn sky, the color it had always been, with stars going out at the western edge and a bruise of light starting to build in the east, and the city below it dark and damaged and absolutely, unmistakably, irreducibly, still there. Still Earth. Raj stood at the perimeter and watched the last of the glow fade and didn't say anything. None of them did. There are moments that belong to silence, the way some arguments belong to silence. Moments that words would make smaller by arriving before the size of the thing has been fully understood. He thought about his mother's kitchen, the specific quality of light in the mornings there, the particular sound the grinder made, the songs that weren't words, but were everything the words would have meant. He thought about all the kitchens in the city behind him, and whether any of them still existed, and what it was going to take to find out. He thought about Captain Doyle and his hands. He thought, we're still here. Not a triumphant thought. Not a relieved thought exactly. Something older. Something that didn't have a word for it in any language he'd been given. The feeling of a thing that has been tested past the point it expected to be tested, and found that it held. Not that it was unbreakable, there was no unbreakable, but that it held. That holding was what it did. That holding was the whole answer, and always had been. The Dominion forces in the field were immediately disoriented. Without the portal, without the convergence anchor, without the energy draw they had relied on for everything, for power, for communication, for the basic metabolic processes their biology depended on in a realm that was not their own. They were cut off in a way no human military doctrine had language for, because human military doctrine was written by people who had always, at some level, been able to go home. They couldn't go home. That was the end of the invasion. Not a single decisive engagement, not a famous battle that history would name. A series of smaller things over the days that followed, negotiated surrenders from Dominion units that had no other option, isolated engagements where units that weren't surrendering were contained, the slow, methodical work of a species that had just defended its home and was not done being careful about it. It took weeks. It was unglamorous and exhausting and necessary. Some of the Dominion generals didn't surrender. The largest of them, the one the fragmentary intelligence reports had called the Sovereign, the one who had sent broadcast challenges no one answered, made its final stand in the industrial district on the 7th day, after the portal had been closed for over 60 hours and its power reserves were failing. It was not the fight the Dominion had intended to have. It was not the overwhelming, structured, superior force engagement they'd been built for. It was a cornered fight, which is a different kind of fight entirely. And the Sovereign had no experience with it. The humans had centuries of it. The Sovereign fell in the 7th hour of the 7th day, and there was no ceremony to it, no grand theatrical declaration of victory. There were 6 soldiers and an engineer and a medic standing in an industrial ruin at dawn, and there was something vast and armored no longer standing, and there was the sound of birds somewhere that shouldn't have been there, that had apparently survived in a drainage pipe and emerged when it seemed safe, which birds do, because they are very old and have seen things end before. But the anchor was destroyed. The portal was closed. The merger was not completed. The world was not absorbed into something it would not have survived. There's a photograph that circulated in the weeks following the closure. It was taken by a civilian with a phone camera at the military perimeter at 0345 on the 5th day. It shows 5 people standing at the edge of a city that looks like it's been through something it barely survived. 4 of them are looking at the sky. One of them, a man in a jacket with crystal fragments in it, head tilted slightly, mouth partway open, appears to be humming. The photograph circulated because it looked, to people who saw it, like something they recognized. Not like a victory exactly. Like something older and more stubborn than victory. Like a species that had been doing this longer than anyone remembered and expected to keep doing it, in the exact same way, past the point where any reasonable calculation suggested stopping. Like people who were not finished being here. In the city, in the failing crystalline overlay, something small moved in the ruins. A rat, maybe. Something ordinary. Something that had waited out the invasion in the dark and was now tentatively testing the air. The sky above it was the sky. The ground beneath it was the ground. Both of them would stay that way for a while.